This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 516 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Fantasy analysts, including yours truly, we do studies all the time that focus on average draft position trends. Just last week, I did an episode on the running back dead zone. That really is just a deeper examination of historical average draft position. Also, can I just say ADP from now on during this episode? I think 99.9% of you know that ADP stands for average draft position. So I'm going with ADP. Anyway, I love studying ADP trends because ADP is essentially a fantasy manager's behavior. And we don't always have easy ways to measure that behavior. It tells us how fantasy managers think year in and year out. And while players change and positions get deeper or shallower, there really are consistent things that we see every single season when it comes to ADP. That's sort of what the running back dead zone episode was all about. On today's episode, I'm going to do some more ADP analysis. This time, my plan is to dig into what happens to team offenses when the fantasy football market seems to be into players in those offenses. In other words, if there are a lot of players from one team getting drafted early, what does that mean? What does it mean at the team level? And what does it mean for that team's quarterback in fantasy? Before getting to the analysis, did you know that FanDuel has a special free-to-play game centered around PGA Tour events? Make golf prop picks on the final round of any PGA tournament on CBS for your chance to win a share of $5,000. Prior to the start of the final round, go on the FanDuel Sportsbook app and submit answers to all this game's prop questions. Answer the most correctly for a chance to win money prizes. So head over to FanDuel for the next PGA Tour event and pick some props for the final round. Age and location restrictions apply. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited. Payouts paid in non-withdrawable site credit that expires 7 days after receipt. For more information, visit FanDuel.com/freegames/swing for the green. So when I started looking into this average draft position data, which by the way is courtesy of my friends over at MyFantasyLeague.com, my main intent was to basically see if fantasy managers could help predict strong NFL offenses through ADP. Basically, if players from the same team are drafted in fantasy football early and often, then that must mean that we expect big things from that offense. Like if we're drafting Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire with top 3 round picks, then our expectation has to be that the Chiefs are going to be good offensively. Not only did I just want to see if we were targeting the right offenses, but I wanted to see how much better those offenses actually performed versus the league average. I'll explain all of this in a second because I'm sure this only sort of makes sense. Basically, a lot of my research has found that after round 5 or so in a 12-team league, things start to tail off in terms of expectation. To put this another way, the opportunity cost is pretty high through about round 5. It's still relatively high in round 6 and 7, but there's a drop-off that occurs after about round 5. And that's just a rough estimation. So what I did was I looked at ADP since 2011, so over the last 10 years. And I looked at all the teams that had 3 or more skill position players selected in the first 5 rounds of 12-team leagues. So top 60 picks. Just to give you an example, last year Seattle was one of 6 teams to meet this criteria. You had Chris Carson, Tyler Lockett, and DK Metcalf. They were all top 5 round picks according to MyFantasyLeague.com's data. Over the last 10 years, we've had 49 different teams with 3 or more teammates getting drafted in the first 5 rounds. And for the record, I'm not including quarterbacks here. Just running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. Of those 49 teams, 10 of them, so only a little over 20% of them, finished the season below the league average that year in total touchdowns. Meaning 80% of them finished above the league's average. And then on top of that, of the 10 teams who didn't finish above the league's average in total touchdowns, only 2 of them finished with more than 5 touchdowns below that average. So basically, only 2 of the 49 teams finished way below average in total touchdowns. One of those teams was an Eli Manning-led Giants in 2013. The other was an Arizona Cardinals team in 2014, the year that Carson Palmer got hurt. If you look at the degree in which these 49 offenses with highly drafted skill players are finishing in total touchdowns, it's pretty glaring. On average, they finished with about 6 more touchdowns than their season's league average. And this is only re-emphasized when you narrow that criteria and look at players drafted in the first 3 rounds rather than the first 5. It doesn't happen nearly as often, for the record. But since 2011, 10 teams have seen 3 skill position players drafted in the first 3 rounds of 12-team leagues. So an average of 1 per season. Over the last few years, the only teams that have hit this new criteria have been Kansas City and Minnesota. It's obvious as to why Kansas City would be involved here. But Minnesota's been fortunate to have a super narrow target tree and an elite running back over the last few years. They didn't make it last year with Stefon Diggs gone, but they did in 2018 and 2019, with Stefon Diggs, Dalvin Cook, and Adam Thielen. Regardless, though, of those 10 teams, 7 of them exceeded the league average in touchdowns scored, and they outpaced that league average by an average of 7.4 touchdowns. Maybe this is a little bit obvious, but all this is to say that if there are teams that have a whole lot of players being drafted in the early rounds of fantasy drafts, chances are those are the right teams to bet on to score a lot of touchdowns. And it could end up being good teams to target with later round picks as well, since our goal here is to associate our players with good offenses. Now, I've done analysis like this in the past for quarterbacks in particular, and I wanted to rehash that and talk about it on today's show, because I think it's really interesting. I did the exact same thing, but instead of looking at total team touchdowns, I looked at where a quarterback was ranked in the preseason and where he finished in the postseason. Because if all of his skill players are being selected early, that means the quarterback is probably good in some way, right? The problem is quarterbacks on those teams, they're generally coming with high ADPs. For example, of the 49 teams since 2011 with 3 or more teammates being drafted in the first 5 rounds, the average quarterback rank in terms of ADP for those team quarterbacks was 8.3. To put this another way, if a team has 3 skill position players being selected in the first 5 rounds, that team's quarterback has been usually drafted as a QB8. That means it's pretty hard for those quarterbacks to really exceed expectation. In fact, if you look at the quarterback rank in terms of ADP and compare it to where those quarterbacks finished, there was on average a 3-spot drop. So that QB8 quarterback finishes the QB11. That's not what you'd like to see. But it's not surprising because there's been a good bit of variance at quarterback when looking at ADP over the last decade. There's a lot of fluctuation there. And on top of that, like I said, these quarterbacks didn't have a lot of room for error with their ranking. They had to be very, very good. What's really interesting though, and I've made this point on the show in the past, is what happens when you specifically look at later round quarterbacks or quarterbacks not drafted in the top 10 at their position. So again, to reiterate, I'm looking at quarterbacks here since 2011 who have had 3 or more teammates who play running back, wide receiver, or tight end, drafted in the first 5 rounds. Over the last 10 years, we've had 16 quarterbacks of the 49 in our sample who were drafted at QB 10 or worse. So think about what this means. These quarterbacks have a lot of good teammates being drafted early, but for some reason, they're being drafted relatively late. Of those 16 with a QB 10 ranking or worse, 13 of them improved on their average draft position by the end of the season. The average quarterback ranking among this group was QB 14 to 15. The average finish was QB 11. I was also curious if this applied to pass catchers only. Thus far, I've been looking at all skill position players, so running backs are included. But what happens if a quarterback has 2 wide receivers, maybe a wide receiver and a tight end? What happens if they have 2 pass catchers who are being drafted in the first 5 rounds? And what I found was pretty similar data. We've had 66 instances of this happening over the last 10 years. And by the way, teams that have 2 good pass catchers, they actually exceed the average in total touchdowns as a team almost as often as if they had 3 top 5 round players. But specifically for quarterbacks, let's go back to quarterbacks. Of the 66 teams, the average quarterback rank in ADP from those teams has been QB 7.5. So QB 7 to 8. When looking at postseason result, that ranking usually drops again by about 3 spots. That's similar to what I talked about earlier. But again, if you only look at late round quarterbacks, we see a trend. Of those 66 teams, 22 of them had a quarterback with an ADP of QB 10 or worse. Of those 22 quarterbacks, only 8 of them finished with a worse ranking in postseason result. The average quarterback ranking among this group was QB 14 to 15. The average finish was around QB 11 to QB 12. So what does this all mean? Well, it's pretty clear and it's obvious to a degree, but teams with a lot of players who are drafted early tend to do better than the alternative. And then in addition to that, those teams generally come with costly quarterbacks. That's not surprising. But if you can find a quarterback who's on one of those teams and who has a low-end QB1 or QB2 price tag, that's a quarterback who's worth targeting. Some examples this season of non-elite quarterbacks with 3 or more players being drafted in the top 60 include Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, and of course, Ryan Tannehill. Tannehill's the most interesting for me there because of what he can do with his legs. If you look strictly at quarterbacks with 2 or more pass catchers, so not running backs who are being drafted in the first 5 rounds, you get essentially the same players. And I think that you could add Joe Burrow in there subjectively because his non-Jamar Chase receivers are still being selected around that area as well. Now, like most studies that I do, I don't think this is everything. It's just another thing to keep in mind as you draft. I'd still prioritize mobility at the quarterback position over teammates with high ADPs. And remember this too, average draft position is not flawless. If you can pinpoint an entire offense that seems to have a good chance to exceed expectation, that's when you can really hit and really profit. Like if the Jets end up being really good offensively this year and you buy into that, then that's a huge W. This is just a small way to find an edge against your peers. Recognize which teams are being drafted early, target those teams, and target the quarterbacks on those teams who are generally being drafted late. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the Weekly Mailbag Show.